Hello, my bookworm friends. Kim here, and welcome on back to Bookworm Buzz. Today's video, my friends, is something a little bit different and a little bit exciting because, yes, I have been reading fantasy novels, and the good news is I have read the first books in 3 very, very popular series. So in today's video, what I am going to be doing for you guys is I am going to be comparing. Let me show you, in fact, what I am going to be comparing. So I am going to be comparing A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas with Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros with The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. Now, I have recently finished reading all 3 of these books. So today's video is going to be for those of you who perhaps are thinking of dabbling in the fantasy genre. Maybe you've heard about these 3 books and you don't know where to start. You don't know which of these series or which of these books is actually going to be for you, if any of them. Or you may be someone who has already read one of these series and you don't know whether to pick up another one because maybe you're thinking it's going to be too similar. You know, you don't want to read another similar series or similar fantasy novel. So today's video is going to be one where I compare and contrast these first 3 books so that you guys can decide which ones you want to read first, if you want to read any of these at all. Or if you have read some of these, maybe this video will help you to decide whether you want to pick up another one of these series or if you don't. So it's going to be a fun video today, you guys, because I have recently finished reading these. So they are fairly fresh in my mind. I have a few, let me call them headings, under which I am going to be discussing these 3 books. So the headings that I was thinking of sort of using in this video will be, firstly, the genre and the tone. The second heading would probably be audience, like what type of reader do you need to be to read each of these books. Thirdly, we will look at the protagonists. We will also take a look at the world building. And of course, another heading will be romance/smut. Some of you love a lot of spice in your fantasy books, some of you don't. So I will be letting you know what the spice factors were, how much romance was in each of these. And then lastly, I will probably just cover the themes, like what themes each of these books go into and what they cover. And then once I have done all of that, I will let you know what I rated each of these books, which one was my least favorite and which one was my favorite. So if that appeals to you, grab a coffee, grab a tea, grab a glass of wine, whatever it is, and join me today, guys, while we do a deep dive into these 3 novels. Okay, my friends, so kicking things off, we are going to look at the genre of each of these books, what these stories are about, what the general tone is, and so on. I'm not going to go into any of these aspects in immense detail, guys, because the video would just be too long. So let's start off with the general genre and the tone of the novel. So starting off with this book. So this is A Court of Thorns and Roses. Many of you might have read this one already, but for those of you who haven't and you're interested in this one, so this one I would say is a romantic fantasy novel with strong fae mythology. Then next up to discuss Fourth Wing under this heading. So this book, the genre of this book is basically also obviously fantasy. I would classify this as a new adult fantasy with dragons and with a romance being part of the story, but not the entire story, not the main focus, especially not at first. And then lastly, when we talk about the Poppy War and what sort of genre or tone this is, so I would describe this as grim, dark, military fantasy. There are war aspects. It has a strong political setting and a strong historical setting. Then let's talk about the audience. So who and what type of readers are the target audience for each of these books? Now, let me just start off by saying I would not actually classify any of these as young adult. In young adult, you really are targeting readers sort of between the ages of, I would say, 12 and 18. These books, their themes go slightly darker than that, so I wouldn't actually say young adult. With some of them, and we will get into that, I will say more new adult. So in ACOTAR, for example, I would say that this is a new adult fantasy. So the main protagonist in this story, Feyre, she is 19. She's 19 years old when the story starts. Some of the aspects of the story, especially in the second half, go a tad dark, not very dark, but a tad dark. So I would classify the audience for this novel as new adult or even adult. Now, you're probably wondering, what do I mean by new adult as opposed to young adult? So as I've said, with young adult books, you are targeting readers sort of between the ages of probably 12 and 18. And with new adult books, you are targeting readers between, say, the ages of 18 and maybe the early 20s. So maybe 23, 24. So with this one, I would say it's new adult or adult. Then moving on to Fourth Wing. Now, again, I would not consider Fourth Wing a young adult novel. Again, I would classify this one as new adult or even adult. The main protagonist in this book is Violet. She is 20 years old when the book starts. So you can sort of gather from that, the age of the main character, that this is more new adult. And then moving on to The Poppy War, this one I would classify as adult. So the target audience for this book is definitely not young adult, maybe new adult, but definitely adult. However, the strange thing is, Rin, the main protagonist in this novel, is the youngest protagonist out of all three of these books. When the book starts, Rin is actually aged, I think she's about 14. Now, through this novel, she does grow up a little bit. I think by the end of the novel, she's about 17. Don't quote me on that, because I don't think the novel actually ever says. But you just work this out as a reader because of how the story has progressed and the years that have gone past. So when you first meet her in the opening chapters, she is 14. But don't let that put you off. This is a very adult novel. Out of the three, this is definitely the one that I would consider the most hardcore in terms of its content. So in summary then, this is what I would classify as an adult novel. The other two I would classify as new adult, bordering on adult. Okay, my friends, then next up, under the head of protagonists, let's discuss the main protagonists in each of these novels. So I have already touched on this aspect under the last heading, but let me go into a little bit more detail. So in ACOTAR, your main character here is Feyre. So she is actually a mortal girl who ends up entering the land or the world of fae or fairies. So basically, this is about her navigating her way around the fairy landscape. It's also obviously got romance. It's got a little bit of politics to it as well, sort of fairy politics. And Feyre's arc in this story is centered around sort of personal growth, personal development. So that is, in summary, then a little bit about the protagonist in ACOTAR. Then moving on to talking about the protagonist in Fourth Wing. So as I've already mentioned, the protagonist here is Violet. She is 20 years old when she enters this college or academy, the Dragon Riders Academy. So Violet as a protagonist is pretty fragile. When the book starts, she's emotionally fragile, she's physically fragile, but as the story progresses, she is a character who develops. She lives through a lot of hardships, her character develops, and she goes from being sort of a fragile 20-year-old at the beginning to being something quite different by the end. So basically, I would classify her as a fierce underdog who ends up defying expectation in this college. She basically exceeds and does really well in this college. She also has a strong internal voice, and she's also pretty resilient. So in summary then, that is Violet. Then in The Poppy War, we have Rin. Now, again, as I've already mentioned, she is 14 years old at the start of this novel. She is basically a war orphan who is growing up in a family that basically can't stand her. She has a brother who loves her to bits, but her parents are terrible to her, her life is terrible, etc., etc. So she decides to sit an exam to gain entry into this military academy. She does exceptionally well in the exam and she goes into this academy. So when she enters this academy, again, she is sort of lacking a little bit of confidence. She's young. She hasn't had the training that all of her peers in her class have had. But yet she manages to do really well and she succeeds and she climbs through the ranks of this academy to basically become a weapon of war. So her story actually throughout this book is a little bit tragic because she actually descends throughout this book and actually ends up becoming a little bit of a morally gray character. Some people don't specifically love her by the end of the book. She does make some difficult choices, and like I say, things start to unravel for her a little bit. But basically, in a nutshell, that is Rin. Right, my friends, then moving on to discussing the aspects of romance and smut, or as other people would prefer to call it, I suppose, let's call it spice. So let's discuss romance and spice in each of these books, which I know can be very important to some people. So let's now talk about all three of these books in regard to romance and spice. So again, starting off with ACOTAR. So now, in this book, romance is very central to the plot. However, this book actually doesn't contain a massive amount of spice. There is a little bit. There's a little bit of spice in here, but just know there is some spice, but it's not over the top. I have heard that in later books in the series, so from book number 2 onwards, the spice level ramps up substantially and does become very central to the story. There's plenty of spice. So those of you who are here for the spice will definitely enjoy the series in general. But in regard to this specific book, there's a little bit of spice. Even the spicy scenes, from what I recall, they were not overly detailed. They didn't go on for pages and pages. So this one, I would put the spice sort of in this specific book, not in the series in general, but in this specific book, I would say the spice is there, but it's not a major aspect of this book. Then moving on to discussing Fourth Wing. So here as well, I mean, romance is important in the story, but it's not the focus of the story. I feel that the characters, the academy, what they go through, becoming dragon riders, all of this, I feel that is actually more important in this book than the romance. But don't get me wrong, the romance is there, guys. It is important in the story. Basically, it's an enemies to lovers romance. But what I did like is that the romantic aspect actually developed at a nice pace. What I didn't mention actually in regard to ACOTAR is that I did feel the romance here was a little bit insta-love. It happened very quickly. It sort of just seemed to go from 1 minute Feyre was hating this fairy, and then the next minute she was falling in love with him, to the next minute she would give her life for him. So I did feel that that was a little bit insta-lovish. But in Fourth Wing, I thought the romance aspect was done a little bit better. I thought it developed a bit slower and I really did enjoy it. As for the spice, this has a couple of very spicy scenes. So there are a few sex scenes in here. I think it's pretty much two that go into some detail. There's definitely spice for those of you who enjoy your spice. The sex scenes in Fourth Wing were more detailed and more graphic than I remember in ACOTAR. So definitely a spice here and a good romance here for those of you who are looking for that. And then lastly, the Poppy War. Now, this appealed to people like me. There is basically no romance in this book, and so there is no spice, zero. There are no sex scenes, there's no romance. I mean, at one part, I almost felt like there was a little bit of a romance aspect, perhaps just starting to germinate. But I mean, having finished this book, I can honestly say to you, I don't necessarily think that there was. It almost came across as if the author may be going in that direction. But by the end of the book, I realized and decided, nope, not going in that direction. So no romance, no sex scenes, no smut. So if you are someone who is wanting a good fantasy story that is more war-orientated, but where there is no romance, no spice, then this will be for you. There are really interesting friendships and just relationships that develop in general. And by that, when I say relationships, I mean more sort of with, you know, like between Rin and her teachers at the academy, the friendship and dependency that she develops on them, and then also friendships that she develops with people throughout the book. That is sort of the focus of the story. There's much more of a focus on that, on trust in terms of new friendships, tutors, people who have guided you in your life, etc., etc. So there's that aspect quite heavily in this book, but definitely no romance. So now, moving on to discussing the aspect of world building. So for those of you who love complex worlds that are maybe a little bit, complex, advanced, maybe a bit difficult to understand, I would say that none of these actually have that. Like, I felt the world building in all three of these novels was great, and it was fairly easy to follow and to understand. So in ACOTAR, what you have is you have the normal mortal world, and then you have the Fae world. So in this book, there is a lot of world building around Fae mythology, Fae courts, different magic systems, mythological elements, all that type of thing. I did also find that this book, the world setting in general in this book was a lot more whimsical, and I suppose I can say a little bit seductive in tone. So hopefully that sufficiently summarizes the world building for you guys in ACOTAR. Right, then the world in Fourth Wing is a little bit different. Here the focus is really on a school, a college, an academy. There's focus on dragons, elemental powers, and just in general, this one has a much more, or let me say it's much more focused on the academy itself. So it has strong sort of fantasy school vibes and tones to this book. Most of this book, in fact, 90 to 95% of this book is set in and around the academy. So the world building is somewhat straightforward. It is somewhat easy to understand. You won't get specifically lost with the world building, but I still really love the world building here because of the dragons and the school, you know, the academy. Right, then in the Poppy War. Now, again, this one is very different to the first two. The only way that I would say it's somewhat similar to Fourth Wing is that there is also academy or school in this story. However, in this story, it's a military academy, a military school. There are no dragons and fantastical creatures like that. So this book has a strong sort of geopolitical setting. It's very historical. It is, in fact, based on aspects that have happened in history, especially in Asian history. This one also is much more focused on heavier subjects like war, training for war, what war does to people and to societies, and so on. So the world building here, again, it is in an academy initially, but unlike Fourth Wing, which sort of stays in the academy the entire book, the Poppy War doesn't. So you do have the academy setting right in the beginning, but then the story evolves, things happen, Rin leaves the academy, she becomes more advanced. You know, we get aspects of gods, we get aspects of shamanism and deities, and being able to use power to talk and to interact and to call on gods. So it's a very different setting. And also what you have here in the Poppy War, and I just want to show you in the beginning, you do have a map, but the reason I'm showing you this map, I didn't show you the others. So there is the map. Now basically what you can see here is that there's one big landmass here, and then there's another smaller island over here. So basically this entire book is set on this landmass over here. So it doesn't get massively complicated in terms of the world building or the setting. Now there are different provinces on that map. I think there are 12. And as the story progresses, Rin spends some time in this province and some time in that province. But basically, because of the map, you will follow what's going on. And then lastly, just to maybe summarize the themes, the different themes of these books, because they are all a little bit different. So again, in ACOTAR, what the main themes are in this book is healing from trauma, moving forward, love versus duty, and then also probably the ability to choose your own path and to put your life onto its own path towards your destiny. And then when we talk about fourth wing, I nearly said fourth wall. When we talk about fourth wing, I would say the major themes here are survival, found family, overcoming adversity, love, and then probably also aspects of challenging authority and the ability to stand on one's own 2 feet. And then in the Poppy War, the themes here become a little bit heavier, I would say. So the themes here are obviously war, believe it or not, but also addiction, power, wielding power, war ethics, and then also the cost of ambition and also the cost of vengeance. So as you can see, quite heavy themes in this book, and definitely a lot heavier than in the other novels in this video. Right, my friends, so hopefully those headings and the discussions that I've had here are helping you to get a feeling for these different books and helping you to decide if you want to pick any of these up or which of these you want to read first, which of these you maybe don't want to read at all. Now, I did mention right at the beginning that we would end off by me letting you know what I thought of these books, which one was my favorite, and what I awarded these books in terms of star ratings. Okay, so coming in third place for me was, or is, ACOTAR. Now, I really enjoyed this novel. Do not get me wrong. I rated this one 4 stars. So that technically means I loved this book, and I did love this book. When I finished reading it, though, I did just feel like it was a 4-star read. I'm a very emotional reader, and I'm also a very emotional reviewer. I will review a book based on many different things going on in my head, but specifically how I feel when finishing the book. So this one for me, although I loved it, I loved going into this world, it wasn't quite a 5-star. I think for me, what detracted slightly was that I did find the first half of the novel a little bit slower. It lacked a little bit of the pace that I would have liked, and also it was fairly light. I don't know if I can use that word. It was fairly light, and it missed any sort of dark aspects to the story that I might have liked. But don't get me wrong, it does go a little bit darker in the second half. So for me, the first half of this book was probably a 3 out of 5. The second half was a 5 out of 5. I absolutely loved what happened in the second half of the story. I loved a new sort of character that we meet and that comes into the story in quite a prominent way. I loved the challenges that Feyre was given in the second half of the book. I loved the fact that there were some darker aspects. So like I say, 3 out of 5 stars for the first half, 5 out of 5 stars for the second half. So overall, I ended on 4 out of 5 stars. Then, my friends, in second place and with 4.5 stars, I have Fourth Wing. So I just loved the story. I loved the academy. I loved Violet. I thought she was such a relatable character. Her insecurities, her physical, emotional, psychological frailty at the beginning of the story. I loved all of that. And then I did really enjoy the romance in this book as well. I like the fact that the romance developed at a more natural and normal pace. Again, I didn't mention it now in my wrap up with ACOTAR, but for me, another problem that I had with this book and why I couldn't and wouldn't ever give this one 5 stars is because the love interest, the romance was just too insta-love for me. It just went from one extreme to the other almost overnight. Whereas in Fourth Wing, I just felt the romance was done really well. I mean, it's a fairly thick book, and it takes, I would say, maybe 3/4 of the book before the romance fully develops in the story. So, I mean, I really did enjoy that aspect. And then I just really loved the dragons. I loved the academy. I loved the training that they had to do. I loved the characters, some of the peripheral characters. I really enjoyed this one immensely. Now, again, when I finished this one, I was very torn on whether to award 5 stars or 4.5. And I had to just go with my heart and my gut, and it just didn't feel 100% like a 5 star. It just missed something for me. So it gets a 4.5 star. I have really thought about why emotionally I'm just not ready to give this book 5 stars. And I think there's one aspect here that just bothers me a little bit. And just to summarize it very quickly, before any of the characters in this book meet any of the dragons that feature in this book, the whole concept of these dragons is that they are vicious, they are terrifying, they are frightening. They kill scholars in the academy just like this, without even thinking twice. If you just look in their direction incorrectly, they will just ravage you with a spurt of fire and you will be done. So that is the setup. That is how we learn about these dragons initially. And then what I found a little bit contradictory was when the bonding between dragon rider and dragon happens, and when the dragons end up choosing their riders, the way the riders would speak to the dragons would be often very derogatory, antagonistic, rude, sarcastic. And although it's very fun to read, and the scenes of interacting, or the interactions between the dragons and their riders could be quite entertaining and funny, I just found that concept just didn't work for me 100%. Because if these dragons were so terrifying, so scary, you can't cross their path, you can't even look them in the eye, then how would it be that you could suddenly talk to these dragons like this right from the start, before you even have a deep relationship with your own dragon? I mean, maybe I could understand if a long-term relationship between dragon rider and dragon developed in such a way that right in the beginning there was this massive level of respect, but then as the story progressed, the rider and the dragon got more relaxed with each other, and that is how, the relationship progressed. But just to right off the bat, be taunting your dragon, being a little bit rude, a little bit sarcastic, it didn't fit in my mind 100% to how I would have thought a dragon rider would have reacted to their dragon right from the start. But okay, enough about that. That basically sums up why I took away 0.5 star. And again, like I say, it's because when I finished the book, that aspect sat a little bit emotionally uncomfortably for me. But still, 4.5 stars, absolutely loved it, would highly recommend it. And then it follows, my friend, that my favorite book out of these three, and scoring a full 5 stars from me, is The Poppy War. Oh, the story was just so good. I just enjoyed this one so much. I mean, this one doesn't even look specifically thick. It's fairly thick. It comes in at about 530 pages. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because I just flew through this book. And even though it's not immensely thick, the other thing I wanted to tell you is that so much happens in the story. In those 530 pages, so much goes on. Now, I have heard 1 or 2 people say that they found the beginning very slow and it took them a while to get into it. I didn't have any issues with the pacing of the story. Yes, maybe the beginning is a tiny bit slower than the rest of the book, but man alive, this book just rocketed forward at such a pace. I absolutely loved it. I also loved Rin. I loved the teachers at the academy. I loved the war aspect. Believe it or not, I wasn't sure that I was going to like that aspect, but I really did. And then I loved the characters of the psych. I'm not going to go into explaining what that is because I don't want to give any spoilers, but I loved those characters. And like I say, I loved the fight scenes, the war scenes. That was all fantastic. Where the book fell maybe a tiny bit flat for me, but I shouldn't even use the word flat. But let me rather say this, where I battled just the tiniest bit was that I found that the magic system in this book was more advanced and more complicated than in either of the other 2 books. So it took a little bit more for me to understand the magic system here, how certain mortals can contact gods and deities and can pull on their powers. And there are scenes towards the end of the book where these mortals have to go into sort of a trance-like state to be able to connect with these gods. And in a few of those scenes, I felt that maybe I was starting to get a little bit lost. But then I didn't. I would pull myself back, I would focus on what was going on, and I did understand everything that was going on. Also, as the story progresses, Rin's character becomes a little bit more complex, and a little bit more morally gray. And I actually enjoyed that. For example, there's a decision she makes right at the end of this book, within the last 5% of this book, where she goes very morally gray. But the strange thing was, I could understand why she made the decision she did. And I could understand her heart and her emotions taking over from maybe what her head was telling her. So yes, for all of these reasons, I absolutely loved this one. As I've mentioned already in this video, I also love the fact that there was no spice. Now, I can do romance. Romance in a book is not something that bothers me, provided it's not the main focus. But I do prefer fantasy novels where there's not a whole lot of spice. So 5 stars, you guys. If you have not read this one and you are an adult reader and you are okay with darker, heavier topics, even war type topics, violence, fight scenes. Now, just bearing in mind, those are not what I would think I would gravitate towards, but yet I loved all of that in this novel. So if you haven't read it and you've been sitting on the fence, I would highly suggest you pick this one up. It was just so good. Oh gosh, my friends, that wraps up this video. I hope it has been entertaining, yes, but I hope it's also given you something. I hope it has led you down a path to wanting to pick up one or more of these novels. Anyway, my friends, this video is definitely long enough. Let me sign off there. If you have read any of these, please do leave a note down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you thought of them and which one was your favorite. If you haven't read any of these and this video has made you want to pick up any of these books, then please also chat to me down below in the comments and let me know which one you are keen to read. Okay, my friends, on that note, let me wish you all happy reading, bookworms. Bye.